Welcome to All the F Words,
a podcast where two writer friends, nearly 30 years apart, explore everything we give an F about. I'm Gabi Moskowitz.
And I'm Joanne Green. On each episode of All the F Words, we'll focus on a theme starting with the letter F. Things like fantasies, films, turning 40, and family.
We'll share stories from our lives and our distinct generational perspectives. We'll look to the experts for insights and ideas.
Today we're going to talk about food issues. So that's a trigger warning right off the top. And if it's a sensitive topic for you, we want you to know that you can skip this episode if you need to. We'll be focusing on what forms food issues take, who has them, why we have them, and how to move through them.
How to help people who have them, and perhaps most importantly, what not to say.
Gabi, I am going to cut straight to the chase and say that as a teenager, I had a full-blown, life-threatening eating disorder. And back then, it wasn't part of the culture. It wasn't part of the lexicon. So people really didn't understand what was going on. Would you say that you have experienced food issues?
Wow. Oh, wow. I'm really interested to hear more about that. And that's so intense. I would say I don't think I ever would have been diagnosed with an eating disorder, but I have definitely had food issues. I think, as growing up at the time that I did, the 80s and 90s, diet culture was a really specific kind of thing. And I know it was even more intense when you were growing up. So I was definitely impacted by that, I would say. But so in what way were you impacted? Well, I think I became aware of my body and how it compared to other bodies from a very young age, and of the connection between food and what my body looked like. I've never been thin. I don't think I would ever have, as a kid, been described as a word that I'm trying to work out of my vocabulary. But obese or seriously overweight, those are words that I'm learning more and more about and trying not to use. But I would say that I became aware that if I maybe didn't eat as much as I wanted to, maybe I could be thinner. I wasn't really very good at sticking to that, and kind of never have been. So I guess in a way that prevented me from having real food issues. But I think that from an early age, I developed a sense of guilt if I ate certain things. So that's probably how I would put it. What about
food issues? Food issues, I was going to say, often come from negative body image that stem from messages we got as kids. And those messages can come from anywhere and everywhere. And so, as you say, in the 80s and 90s, a lot of emphasis. And even when I was growing up in the 60s on you really couldn't be too thin. Let's start with that, right? So thin was the goal. But I do want to say that we're going to be doing another episode of All the F Words on fat phobia. So we're going to save a lot of this discussion for that episode and really focus today more on eating disorders and serious kinds of food issues. So too much focus, of course, on body shape and on size and image and everything else can dictate how we eat, what we eat, when we eat. And it can sow the seeds for an unhealthy relationship with food. And I think that's where it starts for many
in
of
the
us.
60s? Was that the time of Twiggy, the model?
Absolutely. So Twiggy was the first model who became really a cultural phenomenon to everyone. I don't know that there was a famous model before Twiggy, and her body was, what her name describes it as. She was a twig. She was, it was like a little boy's body almost. No breasts, no hips, just a twig. And that was absolutely what you were supposed to aspire to. And I, as a child, was described often, at least in the family, as pleasingly plump. When I look back at pictures, I was never really overweight. So it's really a shame that I was labeled that way because I saw myself as really chubby, and I really wasn't. But that was the lore. And my mom, who was a wonderful mom in many, many ways, but definitely contributed, I would have to say, to my sense of self and around food and body image by doing a couple of things. So I would say these things are probably not great things to do if you are a parent to your child. And one was constantly telling me to eat everything on my plate because there were poor, starving children in Europe. Of course, there were poor, starving children. And they were specifically in Europe to my parents or to my mom. Yeah. So they were probably poor, starving children 2 miles down the road, but we did not eat on their behalf. We ate on behalf of the children in Europe. And then the other thing was that she would always say, hold in your stomach, hold in your stomach. And as though having like a little round belly was a terrible thing. And
how old were you?
And how old was I?
When she was telling you to hold in your stomach. Yeah. How old were you?
Oh, I don't know exactly, but young. I mean, this started young, like probably, I'm thinking, like 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, those ages. Also, my breasts grew early. And so I remember feeling embarrassed about that and like almost developing like sort of a hunched over thing to kind of hide that. And I mean, look, everyone grows up with issues around how their body is developing. And it's never right. It's too soon. It's too late. It's too big. It's too small. You're too tall. You're too short, whatever it is. But I think that there's a lot that we can do as a society and a lot that certainly parents can do for their children to help avoid some of these big pitfalls. And look, food is so loaded. It's not just about sustaining ourselves. It's how we gather. It's how we celebrate. It's how we socialize. And I remember when I was, really at the peak of my anorexia nervosa, which is a diagnosed illness with a 20% death rate still to this day. I remember thinking, why couldn't I have like a gambling problem or a drinking problem? Because then I could stay away from that thing completely. But with food, you can't stay away from it completely.
Oh,
You
absolutely.
see it all the time. You need to eat. So it's a minefield.
Right. Dax Shepard, who's an actor, but he also hosts Armchair Expert, which is a great podcast. He's an addict, and he has said a few times on the show that he really feels for people who have eating disorders or food issues, because if you're a cocaine addict or an alcoholic, it's going to be hard to avoid alcohol. I assume there are situations where it's hard to avoid cocaine, but both of those things are a lot easier to avoid than food if you've got food issues, because you encounter it ideally 3 times a day, right? And it's such a part of our culture, like you said, in the way that we gather. But, food, I say this as a food writer, as a food professional, food in the last decade is having a big, this is kind of a funny thing to say, but it's having a big moment. Food TV has never been a bigger thing. There are a million competition food shows on every network. And we're so, 30 years ago, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, the average American didn't really know about truffles or, maybe how to select a good oyster. And now, because of Instagram, because of Food Network, because of Bravo, this is just common knowledge the stuff that people talk about. We're seeing fancy food on menus in most price ranges across the country now, and it's not just in the coastal elite places. And so the confluence of that with also the fact that we continue to expect women in particular to have bodies that look a certain way, I think has made for a very confusing environment, even though it's kind of always been this way. But we're at a really weird peak cultural moment as far as food and also expectations about women's bodies.
Overlay on that all of people's different food sensitivities that perhaps they didn't know they had years ago, or maybe they really didn't have years ago. And part of that may be due to the way that food is processed nowadays. Now, it may be, for instance, that we have so many more gluten sensitive people because of the way that bread and cereal and all that is made in this country at this time. But, you know, I, for instance, am not eating meat any longer. I'm not eating chicken, turkey, or beef or lamb or, you know, anything basically that walked around on legs, I think. But I'm eating fish. So I'm not really a vegetarian. And my husband doesn't eat eggs, but that's because he doesn't digest them well. But I eat eggs, so we're not vegan. We both eat cheese, but because we want there to be a lot of choices, we also buy vegan cheese. And I mean, it's all crazy. My son is vegan. His girlfriend is gluten-free. So we had a sort of challah with no eggs and no gluten. It looks like a challah. He calls it a challah. But, you know, it's all about food issues, some of which are psychological, emotional issues where food is the arena to play out an anxiety disorder. But in other cases, it's flat out a food issue, or
We're a real, you know, we are a real purity culture in a lot of ways. You know, and that can take on a lot of different meanings. Usually when we talk about purity culture, we're talking about Judeo-Christian cultures where virginity is prized, where girls are expected to be a certain way. But I'm thinking a lot about the way that we equate food and morality. And some of this stems from the concept of sloth in the Bible, and this idea that people in larger bodies are doing something wrong, that they're lazy. And so when we see a lot of times, I think about the way that a lot of my girlfriends and at different times people in my family have talked about what they're eating, and there's almost it's almost like there's a little bit of an apology for eating food that is, you know, maybe considered quote unquote unhealthy, and it's like we're indulgent, right? And we're wanting to communicate that it's like if we don't have bodies that fit the standard, whatever that is, then we're at least sorry about it. And we're at least working toward, it's like, I remember a guy in college telling me that when he went out with a girl, he didn't like it when she ordered the burger. He liked it when the girl got the salad. And I remember thinking, like, what an absurd and stupid thing. And why would you fucking say that to me? Oops, sorry for the F-bomb.
I hope you didn't go out with him a second time.
Oh, no, I did not. Well, we were not on a date. If a guy had said that to me, this was just a friend. If a guy had said that to me on a date, I would have probably left. But the
friend, at least you could have the hope of reforming.
I don't remember exactly what I said, but I think my face indicated my disapproval. But there's this, I do think that we and I feel it. It's something that I'm trying to actively fight in myself. The desire to explain our food choices because we're thinking about the way other people are judging us. And, you know, it's interesting, you were talking about parents and, you know, what parents can do. And I was raised by an incredible, loving mother who had a lot of her own food issues and who was not critical of my body, but I think that her criticism of her own body was hard for her to conceal. And I really felt this. I remember, you know, thinking she was the most perfect and beautiful woman in the whole world. You know, she was my first, my template of what female beauty was. and being so confused as a kid about the fact that she didn't feel that way about herself, and worrying when I got older that that meant something about me because I looked like her. I was shaped like her, like the way she was. And so now, as a mom of 2 kids, now my mom and I can talk about that kind of stuff, and we're both trying to actively unlearn everything that society taught us about how bad to feel about our bodies. But now I'm the mom of 2 kids, and 2 girls in particular, and all kids. I think men, especially gay men, are far bigger sufferers of eating disorders than we ever knew before. But still, it is by and large a much more diagnosed issue with girls. And I have tried really, really hard. And it's so difficult because my feelings about my body and my feelings about food are so ingrained in who I am. But I've tried so hard to not talk about them, to talk about food like it's a delicious, yummy, fun thing that gives us energy, to not do what you were talking about, that your mom said about making you eat everything on your plate. That is definitely
big no-no.
Big no-no. Despite where people are starving. One thing I've learned from reading a bit about intuitive eating is that food is wasted, whether food waste obviously is a big problem, and maybe we should take that on as another F word. That said, finishing the broccoli that you don't want to eat or that you're too full to eat, or making your kids do that, that's not going to really stop food waste in a really big, impactful way. And so all it's going to do...
Nor do you get a gold star for eating all of your broccoli, right?
No. Or all of your chicken or all of your apple pie. And in fact, food is wasted whether it stays on your plate or whether you eat it when you're too full for it. And so one thing I'm trying to do is really honor my body's hunger and honor, and it's really hard. I have a 3.5-year-old who sometimes eats everything on her plate in 1 second, and sometimes takes 2 sips of milk and decides to call it a day. And it is so counterintuitive, but I'm working really hard to believe that she wants to thrive. And if she says she's done, to not make her finish. And in fact, I'm doing something that feels absolutely wild, but it keeps being recommended and it seems to be having a positive impact. I'm serving her dessert on her plate with dinner. So I know.
Heretical, radical. I thought that we should devote at least a few minutes of our conversation today to dessert because it is such a loaded concept. I was taught that if you had willpower, which was, a value above all other values, then you didn't need dessert, right? If you ate the things that you should eat, you wouldn't need dessert. And if you had dessert, it would be fruit. It would be
let me ask you a
applesauce
question.
Or can't. Mm-hmm.
Do you remember Snackwells? In the 90s?
I know of them. Were those the low-calorie cookies?
All right. As the daughter of a 90s diet mom, let me talk to you about some of the stuff we used to consume. Crystal Light, always Crystal Light in the fridge, which to this day I have fond memories of, even though it's like aspartame and fake flavors. Do you remember Crystal Light?
I do, and it reminds me of us having ice milk instead of ice cream. Really, like if you're going to do it, right? If you're going to eat ice cream, but ice milk?
Wait, what is ice milk?
Thank God that's no longer a product.
Is that like low-fat ice cream?
Yes.
I feel like it
Cool
needs
Whip
another
instead
round
of whipped cream.
Oh, yeah. Ice milk to me sounds like it needs another round of marketing work. Like they need to.
Well, right. The reason you haven't heard of it is that it's a terrible concept. But those of us who are, obsessed, and this is before we were even worried about diabetes or high fat. That came way later. This was just more like how can we, it was like getting a bargain. It was the food version of getting something on sale, right?
Yeah.
Getting something for nothing, or getting yeah, all the flavor without the calories.
Oh, the
Yeah,
fat-free
it's
days. Or that could be another F word we could dive into someday. The fat-free days of the 90s. And, well, I guess we were kind of, Atkins came around in the late 90s, and that was its own thing, at least in my house when I was growing up. But the fat-free days where everything was fat-free in the world, and we vilified fat, and I think research has shown that that's had a bad impact on blood sugar and diabetes rate, and also on the absorption
yes.
of nutrients, because you need fat to absorb vitamins.
100%. So first of all, when you take away fat, you have to up the sugar, right?
Of course.
It's a balance between the fat and the sugar. So that's number one. I want to get back to eating disorders
Right.
for a moment, but I just before that want to say that I think it's really hard to get certain messages out of your brain. And I think it probably depends on how old you were when that was the messaging. Like maybe for you, it was in the 90s. So, for me, it was much more about sugar earlier on, before the whole fat phase, the obsession about fat content. It was all about sugar. And then, of course, even before that, I'm sure it was something else. But I think we get certain ideas locked into our head, and it's really hard to kind of move beyond that, even though the research at any given moment is telling you something else. The crazy thing is that I don't think there's ever an absolute. I think it's at one moment, we're getting one piece of information, and all we can do is really listen to what the experts are saying at this moment in time, with the full awareness that 5 years from now, they're going to be saying something slightly different, or maybe dramatically different.
Well,
but let's define our terms for some of these eating disorders. So anorexia nervosa, which I referenced that I had, diagnosed at age 17, had never heard of it. Nobody outside of the medical world had ever heard of it. It is a condition in which people deliberately starve themselves or severely restrict their food intake. Doesn't mean you're doing this. I absolutely didn't know I was doing this at the beginning. I went on a diet with my girlfriends. We were graduating from high school. We all probably could stand to lose 5 pounds. So what? And we began competing, and I was going to win at this competition.
Tell me
we
what
had
that
a chart.
meant. Oh my gosh.
It meant, how many calories, you ate in a day, what you ate.
Do you remember?
Yeah.
How many?
And how much weight you lost. I mean, we would weigh ourselves. And over the course of that summer, between senior year in high school and freshman year in college, I lost 25 pounds and was objectively thin. When I went off to college, got on a plane to go to school 1,000 miles away from Boston to Chicago, waved goodbye to my parents. I had never, mind you, seen the school before. My parents hadn't been to Chicago ever. Bye. Got on a plane, and they said, don't lose any more weight. And I proceeded to lose 25 more pounds during the fall quarter. So I walked off the plane at Christmas vacation, and my parents burst into tears when they took one look at me. I looked like a victim from a concentration camp. And it was only then, that week, that it dawned on me and them and everyone that I had a serious problem, and that this was, in fact, disordered behavior, and it wasn't within my control. Because the whole thing when you have an eating disorder is that you're trying to control what feels out of control. So anorexia and bulimia, which is technically called bulimia nervosa, that's a condition where someone eats large quantities of food and then purges it, often through vomiting, but could also be through laxatives or excessive exercise or all of the above.
What's the difference between that and orthorexia?
Orthorexia, which is actually a fairly new term, is obsession with what one deems to be healthy or pure food. So when you were
Oh,
talking
okay.
about purity
Mm,
earlier, that would be deciding, for instance, that Whole 30 is really a good way to go and doing it for 6 months.
got it.
Um, or some may say that there are some people who are vegan who are orthorexic. I mean, you could be vegan and be completely mentally healthy and
Hmm.
physically healthy. And I think there are many experts who would say it is, in fact, the healthiest diet that a human can um, observe. But at the same time, food is such a quagmire, I think, because when you become religious about it, when you become, I can't break the rules, and the orthorexia almost comes with I'm better. I mean, all of these come a little bit with an I'm better than you. I mean, anorexia for sure did for me, where I felt like I'm not like those other people. I don't have to stuff my face.
Mm.
um, I would
It was
watch
it was a way
people,
for you to
in the
prove it to yourself.
it was a way for me to prove it. It was a way for me to feel better about myself. It was a way. My mom had that whole thing, as I mentioned earlier, about willpower. So if my mom's ability not to eat dessert and never to splurge ever, ever, ever was of very high value, then somehow that got confused in my mind that if I could eat the absolute bare minimum number of calories on any given day, then I would be better. That would, that would improve my self-esteem. And mix that all up with this Twiggy, you can't be too skinny notion, and with the fact that I was an anxious person and having a hard time with this. I'm sure, like in retrospect, I went through years of therapy, and picked this apart as ad nauseum, as you can imagine. Um, a hard time with transitions. Often people have eating disorders or they flare up at times of transition. So this, for some young girls in particular, it's at puberty. So it's that transition from childhood to adolescence, or their body changing. When leaving home is another big one. So in my case, leaving home, going to college, taking care of myself. It happened at that point. Bulimia is tricky because you can hide it. And many, many people with bulimia successfully hide it for years and years and years.
Mm.
Um, Anorexia is kind of out there for everybody to see. The other
Mm.
thing I wanted to mention is binge eating, and that is a condition in which someone regularly overeats but doesn't purge.
Mm.
And then that can result in a person's body growing larger and larger and larger.
Well, and I would imagine all of these, in particular, bulimia and binge eating, come with, well, and anorexia. It's not just bodies shrinking and getting larger. It's also about the impact on internal organs. And I know with bulimia, skin and teeth, hair is impacted by all of these. The our bodies need food as fuel to power all of our cells, and so when that system, whether it's too much or too little, or restricting and purging, or binging and purging, all of that is going to be impacted. So I would imagine that it's not just about sizes. I'm really interested. I'm wondering if you would talk a little bit about your recovery and how and what it's like for you. This was so many years ago. What it's like, how you feel now.
Okay. So, yeah, this was a very, very long time ago. At the time, there was no field called eating disorders therapy. Now it's a, fully developed, fairly sophisticated field. I did a bunch of research for today's episode, and I just kept shaking my head thinking, my gosh, if this information had been accessible to me, to my family, and in fact to my therapist back then, maybe my recovery would have gone quicker. Maybe it would have been better. I don't know. But the best that they could offer me back then was Freudian psychoanalysis, 3 times a week, lying on a couch, free associating.
Oh boy.
And the 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 psychologist said nothing. And when I say nothing, Gabby, I mean I caught him sleeping once.
Oh,
Like he would
geez.
sit there, uh-huh, and the only thing I ever heard him say was, "Well, how did you feel about that?" Or, "Well, how did that make you feel?" That's it. That was it. There was no guidance. It was me out there like in a rudderless ship with like a boat with no oars, no paddles, nothing, just kind of free
Uh,
associating and just talking. The only good thing about that was that it didn't focus on food at all. So it focused on everything behind the eating, which was really, what needed to be healed. And then once a lot of that inner stuff could be healed, then I would be able to develop a healthier relationship to food. So they say people with eating disorders often have low self esteem. Some of them struggle with past trauma, certainly with lack of control over their lives. It's a lot about control, feelings of inadequacy, and it's often accompanied by anxiety and or depression. And so this need to control what you eat is a way to exert control over your life, even when the challenges that you're struggling with have little or nothing to do with food or eating. Let me give you some statistics, Gabby. Eating disorders are common in people of all genders at all stages of life. 9% of the US population will develop an eating disorder. And interestingly enough, so will 9% of the worldwide population.
oh, wow.
I understood back in the 70s, and probably into the 80s, that this was really a problem of people with privilege. That, you didn't find anorexia in a place where people were struggling to figure out where they were going to get their food. And that there may be some truth to that, but I mistakenly thought of it as something that would be really a Caucasian person's illness, that it was probably popular in Europe, and less so in other places. But the statistics now show otherwise, that BIPOC, which is people of color and biracial people with eating disorders, are half as likely to be diagnosed or to receive treatment, less likely to have been asked by a doctor about any sort of eating disorder symptoms. Black teenagers are 50% more likely than white teenagers to exhibit bulimic behavior, such as binge eating and purging. Hispanic people are significantly more likely to suffer from bulimia than their non-Hispanic peers. And Asian American college students report higher rates of restriction compared with their white peers, and higher rates of purging, muscle building, and cognitive restraint than all of their peers combined. So again, we have a lot of assumptions here that aren't necessarily borne out by the truth. Eating disorders are most common in teenagers and young women. Up to 13% of young people may experience at least one eating disorder by age 20. So it's a very, very serious situation. Eating disorders are among the deadliest mental illnesses, second only to opioid overdoses.
Oh, boy.
So, as common as they are, we shouldn't just think of them as a common cold at all, because while many people are lucky enough, as I was, to get good help and treatment, and I certainly, went back into therapy at other points during my life for other reasons and to deal with other situations, many, many people carry eating disorders throughout their lives. And eating disorders can come on at any stage of life. And I bet everyone listening knows somebody
So
who's
having
at a
grown,
later stage of life.
oh, I mean, sure. I'm curious, having had this as a young woman, and now so many years have passed, you've learned so much about yourself, you've done so much therapy, or you're in a different place. What kind of do feelings come up for you still about this kind of thing? Do you
You mean about food specifically? I think
yeah.
I've developed a whole way of dealing with food. I definitely focus on health and eating healthy, healthfully, or whatever I at any given moment determine that to be. I said earlier that I'm not eating meat now. Some may say that is, you know, disordered behavior. I don't think it is. I think it's a choice I'm consciously making, both for my health and for the sake of the planet.
I think
Um,
it's only disordered if you feel like you're restricting yourself, if you feel like you're depriving yourself. I think it sounds to me like that's not what's going on.
Absolutely not. I mean, a good Impossible Burger, like totally fills that need for me. I've never been much of a meat eater, I should say that. And I never really liked meat all that much. And I was vegetarian for about 4 years in my 20s. So this isn't a brand new thing for me by any means. But I'll tell you where it still is kind of an issue. I weigh myself and I'm thin. I definitely am not overweight by any means. I have not been overweight at any point in my adult life, and I'm I'm fit and get a lot of exercise. But why do I weigh myself? I don't know. I think it's like an old thing that somehow when I see a number I like on the scale, I feel good. So that's a little bit neurotic, maybe. I don't know. I mean, we are victims of our culture, right?
We really are. It's I will talk about this more in our fat phobia episode, but I feel like especially in the last few years, especially a lot of my food feelings of late and body image feelings are very connected to having been pregnant twice in the last 4 years. And
Talk about being out of
um
control of your body.
oh my gosh, absolutely. And I was thinking about what you were saying about weighing yourself and how easily it becomes a little bit of an addiction. I when I started to lose my pregnancy weight after Sasha was born, I was feeling very proud of myself and pleased with my progress. And most of it was just from breastfeeding and not being pregnant anymore. And I started weighing myself because when you're pregnant, you're going to the gynecologist once a month to get a checkup. I was getting on the scale a whole lot more often. I never really weighed myself before. And so I actually bought a scale and started weighing myself after, once the weight started to come off, until I realized that the numbers change incrementally, sometimes, within 5 pounds because of how bloated you are, what time of day, whether or not you're wearing clothes. There are all kinds of things that can impact it. And I also really started to find that I would be like aiming for very specific numbers. And so for the time being, it doesn't serve me. My body is exactly the same. It's like, what is the benefit of, I think this sometimes about my Apple Watch, which, like, sometimes I think this is about my own tendency to get a little bit obsessive. Like, if I've walked, and this is more about like just my own brain, but if I've walked 9,989 steps and I'm getting into bed, you can believe I am doing a lap around my kitchen until that number hits 10,000. And that's crazy. That's so silly.
Right. Right.
But yeah.
Maybe we have too much information and it does set us up for achieving. It's crazy. We have been talking for longer than usual, and I really want to be sure to offer some information to help people who encounter others in their lives, particularly children or young people who they think might be exhibiting some of the signs of having an eating disorder. Like, when do you know that it's dieting gone awry, or when do you know that it's kind of leading to that tipping point where this is actually a problem. And so some things to look out for are changes in mood. If you see what looks like depression or anxiety, if you see a person becoming defensive or irritable when approached about their eating habits, if people seem to act controlling about letting others see their emotions or being very restrained in their emotions, if you see someone expressing guilt, helplessness, or low self esteem. And then the outward signs are, of course, rapid or excessive weight loss, people who feel cold a lot of the time, constantly feeling cold, skin looking really dry or yellowish. You were saying earlier about teeth and hair, fine hair, brittle nails, all that sort of stuff. Mouth lesions, chronic sore throat, um, chipmunk cheeks. I've never even heard that phrase, but it's when the glands on the sides of the jaw enlarge, and that can be caused by frequent purging. Girls with low weight may not get their periods, and that was certainly true for me. I didn't menstruate for 2 years from age 17 to 19, and what you need to know about that is that is a key time of women developing estrogen that strengthens their bones. So a lot of times, women who have anorexia later develop osteoporosis, including myself. So, how to reach out to someone with an eating disorder. If you see it, don't ignore your concerns. That's number one. Be honest about what you notice. And it's going to take a lot of courage to start a conversation, but you could be instrumental in saving someone's life. So there are ways to start the conversation and ways not to. So I'm just going to run through these fairly quickly, but we will have in our show notes links where you can do a much deeper dive on all of this information. You want to try to pick a time when you can speak in private and preferably in person. You want to express your concerns in a caring and non-judgmental way. You want to try to remain calm and respectful and positive while you talk. Have concrete examples ready. It's important that you be direct and you share what you've noticed about changes in the person's behavior. I will say anorexics lie. I have never prior to or since been a person who lies, but boy, when I was in the throes of this disease, I lied all the time and took great pride in it. It's very secretive. There's a lot of shame around the behaviors. And then what to avoid? Avoid commenting on how the person looks. I cannot stress that enough. It may seem counterintuitive, but even a compliment can reinforce the focus on image and on weight. If you tell someone they look really skinny, that may be reinforcing what they want to hear.
Can I actually
any
say,
of it.
To just piggyback on that for a minute, one thing that I have found in my own life and also that I've read a lot about is, and it like you said, it feels very counterintuitive. I would say in general, even if you're not really concerned that someone's got an eating disorder, commenting on weight loss as a positive thing is generally not a good idea. You don't know why someone has lost weight. They could be sick. They could be depressed.
It's none of your business.
It's none of your business. And I have experienced having lost weight and then comments that really feel like a comment on my body before. And it's just so loaded. We don't need to be talking about people's bodies. We certainly don't need to be saying negative things, but you can just tell someone that they look great. There are so many times that I've been told that I'm looking thin or I've lost weight and that I've wished later that someone had just said I looked good. So
or
anyway,
nothing.
Just want to throw that in. Or nothing at all.
Or say nothing.
That's even better.
So in the list of things to avoid is simple solutions, like suggesting that if they would just stop XYZ, everything would be
just
fine.
Eat a burger.
It isn't simple. It's never simple, right? In fact, as I was getting better from being anorexic, there were times when I binged. I never purged because throwing up to me is just like the most disgusting thing in the world. And so I never voluntarily, I don't even know how to do that. And I don't want to know how to do that. I know it's something about your fingers in your throat, but no. But there were times when I binged and that felt both good and also out of control. So then there was all this other psychological turmoil that resulted from that, because it's all about your relationship with food in place of your relationship with other aspects of yourself. Do not criticize someone's eating habits. Just flat out, no matter what. Just don't do it. And above all, do not try to trick or force people into eating. People with eating disorders are using food to gain control over their lives when they feel like they don't have any. So if you make demands about what they eat, you are only making things worse. So basically, I would say love your loved ones, make space for them to share what's really scary for them, what's really hurting. The less talk about food and about body image, the better. And we will absolutely be following up soon in the coming weeks or months with an episode about fat phobia. And that will focus a lot more on body image and what we do to ourselves and what we do to our daughters and sons as well, but really our daughters.
Well, and the way that people in larger bodies are treated and mistreated and misunderstood in our society, because it's a really big issue. I want to also include a recommendation, and we can drop this in our show notes. Dr. Becky from Good Inside, a wonderful podcast that we've talked about on the show before, has a fantastic episode about talking about bodies with kids. And there's a lot of really great advice. I really highly recommend it. There's another Instagram account called Feeding Littles, where they talk a lot about great ways to do food with kids that help encourage a healthy relationship to food. So those are fantastic. We'll make sure and drop those in the show notes.
Great. Are we going to go grab something to eat now, Gab?
I'm starving.
Thanks so much for listening to all the F words. Food. You just can't get away from it, right? You can subscribe anywhere you get your podcasts. And what you do is you see there's a little plus up in the upper right-hand corner. I've been explaining this to many people my age recently. You click on the plus and it turns into a check, and that means you're following us. Write a review if you like us, rate us, and follow us on
Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And if you want more tech support from Dr. Joanne Green, technology expert, like how to subscribe in a podcast, tune in next week.
Bye-bye.
Bye.